the emergence of these trends like China maxing and this weird vibe shift of Silicon Valley China envy, right? There's like all kinds of people who are now doing these like 2-week trips to China and being totally starry-eyed and being like, wow, China's building these humanoid robots and they're like they've got high-speed rail. There's like obsession with Chinese high-speed rail. And I think a lot of that is less about China and more about kind of the West's disillusionment or maybe disappointment with its own dysfunction.
The rise of China has been one of the great stories of the last century, certainly of my lifetime. It's, by some measures, the world's largest economy. It's the world's leading industrial power. Another major story, of course, has been the rise of the internet, how it's disrupted, shaped how we do business, how we do leisure, how we go about our everyday lives. But the intersection of those two stories, the rise of China and increasingly conspicuous, ubiquitous internet, is often under-discussed. How has the experience of the internet shaped Chinese political culture and literature? How has it allowed people to express forms of dissent with their government? What political and personal possibilities has it created? What kind of business models has it led to? All of that is discussed in a fantastic new book by Yi-Ling Liu, The Walldancer, Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet. I am absolutely curious about all of this, particularly because this is a series of stories and perspectives we simply don't have access to here in the West. You know and I know what our politicians and media class say about China, and certainly what they think about them too. But how do they view us? Yi-Ling, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're very happy to have you on. You know, I often find the conversations relating to China, East Asia, some of the most rewarding. You know Karen Howe?
I know Karen very well.
Yeah, I think she was our most watched episode of Downstream in 2025.
I'm not surprised. Her book was excellent.
It's very, very good.
Yeah.
This is also a very good book. Briefly, you were born in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your story, because of course it does add authority to the subject matter you talk about in your book, The Walldancers.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I went to an international school, and I considered myself kind of having grown up on the fault lines of two very different systems, two political systems, cultural ecosystems, digital ecosystems. And I often traveled back and forth to the mainland as well. So I had a kind of foot in the mainland, a foot in Hong Kong. And I eventually went to college in the United States, where I was there for 4 years before I decided that I wanted to return to China and specifically return to Beijing to report and write.
So when were you born?
I was born in 1995.
So just before the handover of Hong Kong.
Yes, that's right.
Of course, in 1997.
That's right.
In the pouring rain.
Yes.
And how old are you when you moved to the US?
I was 18.
And then back to China when?
23.
I find it interesting. There's clearly this growing genre of Chinese or Chinese-centered thinker, writer, somebody like Dan Wang, who I think was born in Canada, I think. Karen Howe, of course, you know, she's now living in Hong Kong, again, sort of living and stepping between two different systems, civilizations. And yourself, do you think there's a growing number of people that kind of stride both of these cultures, these civilizations, the Anglophone world and the Sinophone world?
Absolutely. And many of them I have a great deal of respect for. And I think a lot of that is a result of how much exchange has taken place between these two worlds over the past couple of decades. So that's everyone from people who were born and raised in China and then ended up going to school or doing their jobs in the United States or the UK or elsewhere. That also can be people who, you know, were born and raised in the US or the UK and maybe have like Chinese parents or Chinese heritage and decide to go back to China to work and study to kind of re-engage with their roots. And then there are people like me who, you know, was born in Hong Kong and kind of grew up with these two different strands already. And so I think I'm really pleased to see that kind of straddling. I think it allows for a much more plural and kind of nuanced perspective on two countries and China in particular, a country that is increasingly seen through the lens of like a very polarized narrative.
Do you think that was a sort of moment where people like yourself, the other guys we just mentioned, they were the expression of a certain moment, so a cultural opening of China, under from Deng all the way through to Hu Jintao, etc., all the way through to Xi Jinping. Do you think that was kind of the expression of a certain moment, and that's actually kind of going behind us, with the Owl of Minerva, and we're now looking in the rearview mirror, and actually people such as yourself who were very comfortable in two different languages, two different cultures, are actually not a relic, that's a very strong word, but sort of culturally contingent, and maybe the future won't look like the past. Maybe the future isn't actually about this opening and about this striding, but actually something a bit more different, a homogenization almost of the Chinese and Anglophone cultural spheres.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're a product of a certain period of time of, in particular, I'd say US and China, but China and the rest of the world kind of engagement. And I would say people would give different time periods from when this peaked, but 2008, with the kind of summer Beijing Olympics, was a moment that China was kind of stepping onto the global stage as this international superpower, and there was this sense that China was liberalizing, and that people from all over the country were traveling there and wanting to get to know China in a different light. The number of Chinese students going abroad was on the rise. I remember up until like 2015, 2016, the kind of major narrative in global universities was that Chinese students were going to be kind of all over American universities. And that narrative has absolutely kind of shifted. I think largely as a result of geopolitical tension and a kind of siloing of the two countries and their cultures from one another. That being said, I don't think we're going to like regress necessarily or return to all the way things were, say, in the 60s or the 70s when China was undergoing the Cultural Revolution and the US was in its kind of McCarthyist era. Some people will say and harken back to that period and say there are moments of that kind of feel present in today's climate. But I think you can't really put the genie back in the bottle. And there are just so many kind of children born of multinational and multi-ethnic families now that you can't just like chop them in half, Like there are so many people who have experienced these two worlds, and it's very hard to then say pick a side or kind of force them to think in binaries back in the way people did.
I think going back to the Cultural Revolution just seems so implausible. I've only really been reading about it in the last couple of years, and I have to say, obviously, crazy things happened throughout the 20th century in every continent, basically. And obviously, many crazy things happen in China, but the Cultural Revolution just strikes me as the craziest. I think there was one statistic, I think, in 1 year of the Cultural Revolution, 19 million firearms were given out to the public. You just think this mass arming of the citizenry is just incredible. What was it like growing up in Hong Kong? So obviously you're born 2 years before the handover, and there's still this idea of, two systems. How did that feel to you as a teenager? You mentioned the Beijing Olympics. You were, 13 in 2008?
That's right.
So yeah, tell us a bit about that period of you beginning to enter young adulthood, that experience of Hong Kong and China just before 2008.
Yeah, I would say kind of my experience growing up in Hong Kong felt very much like I had the ability to inhabit this plural identity, that I could be at once a Chinese person, but also an international person, also someone who was in touch with American culture and British culture while also being in touch with Chinese culture, right? And the school that I went to, it was an international school, so slightly different from, I would say, the kind of typical Hong Kong student experience, but it was important for us to study Putonghua or Mandarin. And so most of our subjects were in English, but we were also studying Chinese. But it meant, the culture of our school was both celebrating Chinese New Year as well as having a Christmas holiday and an Easter holiday. It meant we were reading kind of Dickens and Shakespeare, but also like Lu Xun and Lao She. It meant having quite a bit of a degree of freedom in terms of assessing the history of China and its past. So I remember in history class, we would study the Cultural Revolution in all its flaws and kind of atrocities. And we would also learn about, for example, the Tiananmen protests and the June 4th crackdown, which, if I was someone living in the mainland at the time, as a young student, wouldn't have had access to in the same way as someone who's living in Hong Kong.
And the Opium War as well. You mentioned that in the book.
Yeah.
How was that taught, or how was that taught in Hong Kong?
Yeah. So I can't speak for how exactly it was taught in most Hong Kong schools, but at least in the school that I went to, we studied the IB curriculum. And the Opium War was, when I studied it, it was at once a result of kind of the flaws of a Qing dynasty that had become too filled with hubris and unable to keep in touch with the outside world and was kind of crumbling from within. But we also studied kind of how it was the result of aggressive British expansionism and kind of the greed of the empire and trying to acquire tea and sell opium. And so I think oftentimes when people study that period, say either from China or maybe from the UK, they might get only one side of that narrative, whereas we could kind of learn both sides of the narrative as well as see how it kind of unfolded literally in the city that we grew up in.
I'm sorry to interrupt this conversation. I hope you're enjoying it, by the way. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying having it. I love Downstream. Obviously, Novara as an organization is like a child to me, like a baby. But Downstream is like my grandchild, my granddaughter. It's the baby of the baby. I really enjoy the conversations. I really enjoy meeting our audience out there, actually. They say all kinds of nice things generally about what we're doing with Downstream. I think it's a really important space to have really important conversations. That doesn't mean it's perfect. And it doesn't mean Novara Media is perfect. We want to grow. We have a mission. But we want to go in a direction which actually meets the needs of you guys, which is why we want to hear from you. Our ambition at Novara has always been to be people-powered. That's going to require you letting us know what you think, and not just in the comments. The Novara audience survey is now live. It's a chance for you to give us feedback, the good, the bad, dare I say, even the ugly. We want to know. We are planning to have a massive 2026, and of course a massive few years before the next general election. But we want that input from you to really pack a punch. As a little incentive, if you submit your thoughts by the end of Sunday, the 12th of April, you stand a chance to win one of 5 £50 vouchers to spend in the Novara merch shop. Spend it on books, spend it on a t-shirt, spend it on whatever you like. Just hit the link in the description below or head to novara.media/survey now. So just to clarify what that was like, was that both sidesing, or was it saying here are 2 different interpretations, and as students, you please use your reason and your personal judgment to determine which one you think is more closely adheres to the truth? Because my reading of the first Opium War is just utter barbarity, if I'm honest. You have this seizure of, it's probably the largest seizure of narcotics in human history by the Qing dynasty. They destroy it. They, as I understand it, they dilute it. They then dump it in the sea. And this just leads to, a war, basically, to like you said, fundamentally to get tea and to have a trade surplus, or to have a balance of trade of payments with Qing China. And obviously to modern sensibilities, that's like horrific. It's disgusting. So how was that taught in Hong Kong? Was there a sort of apologism with what the British did, or? Because I want to understand today, a Chinese nationalist, they might be aggrieved at how that was taught.
Yeah.
So put some meat on the bone.
Yeah. No, I mean, let me just try to rewind back to age 15, 16. I would say definitely the language of both sidesism that I used was not necessarily the framework used. It was more kind of like a historiographic approach where it's like, this historian said this, X, Y, Z, and, it's a range of different historians from like British ones to Chinese ones to like actual primary sources and documentation. And it was like, okay, and go forth and write your essay. Like, why did the Opium Wars begin? And so a lot of the work that was being done was just in our own brains as opposed to kind of being force-fed a narrative. I think the key difference between the way the Opium War was taught for us, at least at my school, and say maybe a more conventional Chinese school in the mainland, is it wasn't laced with this kind of narrative of grievance or this narrative of humiliation, right? I think the facts were maybe all laid out and being like, these atrocities did happen. Kind of an entire generation of people got hooked on these drugs as a result of this form of trade. But there wasn't this sense of, and we were humiliated, and therefore we must stand up and push back. We were kind of afforded this level of critical detachment from the material, which I think was very empowering, because on one hand, I could see how it was like connected to my history and connected to the city that I lived in, but it didn't kind of stir up an emotional response or a response of kind of victimhood that I think is not often very helpful when trying to teach like a younger generation about history.
So growing up, did you often hear about that phrase, Century of Humiliation? Because of course, again, that's core now to China's ambitions to reassert itself on the global stage. We'll talk about them a bit later on, but the wolf warriors online that have kind of emerged in the last 10 years. Was that really a phrase that was absent when you were growing up?
Yeah, it was only present in history class. That's what I'll say.
But you did hear it?
I did hear it,
right.
But primarily when understanding why people thought and believed a certain way. So I think I kind of had the luxury of maybe a kind of distance from that sentiment, right? I think people around me weren't like, and we were humiliated as a result of that. Mm-hmm. It was more like people were humiliated, or people have been humiliated as a result of that. And that's just one arm's length, right? That one kind of level of distance. I'm sure, for example, my grandparents were passed and a lot older when I started learning about this history. They'd both passed when I started learning this history, or didn't talk to me about it. But I'm sure if I did talk to them about it, they would have experienced that much more viscerally. And it allowed me to understand their experience and their pain without necessarily kind of internalizing it as my own.
It's similar, I guess, to this country with things like the Enclosure Acts. Over hundreds of years, regular people in England and elsewhere in Britain have their land taken away, or people are press ganged into the military. I mean, a crazy statistic. I was talking to Rana Dasgupta on this show a few weeks ago. 250,000 English men were press ganged into the Royal Navy and the British Army over about 150 years. That's the claim in his book. But like you say, that's kind of taught as this, abstraction and historical fact. People aren't sort of meant to feel aggrieved over it. So you're being taught a certain kind of curriculum in Hong Kong, which is obviously distinct to the Chinese mainland, even after 1997. What was your first experience like with the internet, and when was it?
Yeah, well, I'd say I'd had different first experiences with the internet and different first experiences with the Chinese internet. And I would say my experience of the World Wide Web, or just like blogging online for the first time, was probably when I was like 6 or 7, maybe as early as 5. And I think it must have been a combination of Google, like Google's I'm feeling lucky option, emails, I think MSN at some point, maybe later on, and Neopets. So that was probably my early experience of the internet. I think it was very much like part of my childhood and my early childhood almost. So like as early as 5 or 6. So
turn of the millennium with
exactly. So I think having spoken to many people who have like the first experience of logging on for the first time as this kind of like exhilaration or revelation, I was just a little bit too young to have that. It was kind of part of the fabric of my life, not necessarily in the same way as it is for Gen Zs and young people growing up today, but I don't remember that kind of moment of aha, like I'm connected to the world for the first time. It was almost this like ordinary, banal technology that had been slowly introduced to me. My experience of the Chinese internet, I would say, felt slightly different, because I think that my kind of first experience that I can remember, at least, was probably during 2007 and 2008, when I was visiting Beijing to see my grandparents and going to participate, or not participate as an athlete, but to watch the Beijing Olympics. And I remember I was using the internet for the same things like Facebook, Google, and Neopets. And all of those things just became increasingly hard to access. And it just happened to be that during those years, Facebook was getting taken down and blocked. Google was not yet blocked, but there were a lot of things. I remember researching different things, for example, like the Tiananmen Tankman and not being able to access it and thinking, oh, that's interesting. Like you can access this back home in Hong Kong, but not here. And then eventually those were just so hard to use, and that I started using VPNs, and that was an era of free VPNs, so they were spotty. I didn't know that you could pay for some and have better access. And so I just remember spending a lot of time in Beijing on Neopets because I couldn't access the websites that I was able to back home.
So Facebook is in China 2008, 2009-ish.
Yes.
Google is there for a little bit longer, right? Until
Yes.
the early 2010s.
That's right.
But before that, we still get the Great Firewall of China, which I'm sure many people have heard about. So I think the World Wide Web it kind of makes its debut in China in 94.
Yes, but 95 is when it's like commercialized so that ordinary users can use it.
And then we get the Great Firewall when?
The Great Firewall, so technically was introduced in 1997. And this was when authorities introduced a system that was called the Golden Shield Project. And so the Great Firewall is just a kind of slang term, a moniker that two scholars came up with in a Wired article, Sangye and Jeremy Barmé. So it was an informal name and not one that they came up with themselves. The Golden Shield Project was primarily this system of censorship, primarily this filter that prevented forbidden content, links, words from coming in, and making sure that the information that came in was carefully controlled, right? And so that was introduced in 1997, but it has since then, over the years, expanded into much more than just a filter, into like an entire system of surveillance and control. And so when we think of the Great Firewall today, and even as early as 2008, 2009, it's not just kind of a filter of banned websites and words. It also includes, top-down internet regulators who are issuing censorship directives and policies. It includes like a whole network of content moderators at social media companies who are on the back ends, scrubbing words one after the other off their platforms. And then I think a very important part that I think of as part of the Great Firewall that people don't necessarily think of or refer to is the kind of like psychic, internalized self-censorship that people feel because they know about the potential repercussions of expressing themselves online in certain ways.
Do you think that there's more propaganda in a society where you have that kind of authoritarian top-down closure of public debate, or is it the other way around? I've heard a really interesting argument recently, which is that in a democracy, you actually need more propaganda precisely because, there's popular sovereignty and people seemingly, make their own minds up. Whereas actually, in a system like China, where you have that infrastructural closure of debate, it's kind of less necessary. There's an interesting sort of dynamic there where people obviously associate, since Orwell, more authoritarian structures with greater levels of propaganda. But I wonder, is that even true necessarily?
My instinct is no, just given the amount of propaganda that I've seen on the Chinese internet, despite the fact that you can scrub off content.
What kind of propaganda?
All kinds, like patriotism, for example, nationalism, like nationalist content is continually amplified. And that could be an actual state organization or a state news outlet like CCTV, which is the state television channel, kind of like extolling Chinese history. And like a common phrase is like 5,000 years of Chinese history. And we see that in everything from TV shows to like hip hop music, which I write about in the book, to like science fiction novels, to just like everyday news, right? There's this sense of everything needs to be glorified and presented as China as being very patriotic. So that's one that appears everywhere. I would say like another example is propaganda that's related to specific policy agendas, right? So right now, there's China suffering from demographic decline. Women don't want to get married and they don't want to have kids, and that's a huge issue for the government. And so now they're using all kinds of ways to use propaganda to encourage that. And that might be like advertisements or even just like social media content by state outlets that are extolling a kind of vision of the trad wife, of someone who marries and stays home and has kids. And I would say like a more kind of subtle form of propaganda, or maybe subtle is the wrong word, but one phrase that comes up often in Chinese social media feeds is this phrase positive energy. And I think in Chinese it's 正能量. So there's this sense that it's not sufficient to simply scrub off quote unquote negative energy from the web. So it's not sufficient to simply take down what they consider negative content. And that's everything from like excessive flaunting of wealth to most recently like queer content and quote unquote sissy boys, or some of the more obvious forms of negative content. So like political dissent or any form of like collective mobilization. That's not sufficient. Like there needs to be an infusion of something else that people can latch onto. And that's usually positive energy. And what's positive energy is like healthy marital values, standing up for the country, so a phrase that they use a lot is like core socialist values. And then sometimes it's even as simple as like going on to a social media platform like Kuaishou, which is kind of like a Douyin or a TikTok for more third-tier cities. And they'll even have like a positive energy feed. And on that feed, you'll have like pandas like hugging each other, or like an old granny like doing calligraphy, just like very wholesome content that's designed to make you feel good and feel like the world is good. I think one way that I have liked to describe those positive energy feeds are like Disney meets Pinterest meets the Communist Party, right? It's like very Puritan, patriotic, and maybe playful.
I mean, that sounds like quite good propaganda. I mean, that's, again, as somebody who's not particularly, I'm not a fan of propaganda, but I mean, that sounds, there's an argument that that's preferable to doom scrolling, for instance. And I suppose there's a couple of layers there. One is, when you're talking about the propaganda of China as a 5,000-year-old civilization and this kind of, this nationalist boosterism, as somebody in the UK, I mean, I see the exact same on GB News. Or as somebody in the United States, they might say, well, I see the exact same thing on Fox. And of course, then it's just a degree of scale. So these same things exist in these other countries, just probably not to the same scale because they don't have that fusion of state and civil society like China does. That's kind of the first point. But secondly, I mean, that does sound quite nice that people just, are being subjected to this positive energy. And this comes out of a book in China, right? Written by a gentleman called Richard Wiseman.
Yes. It's actually a British book, funnily enough. Yeah, it's a British book written by this kind of, I don't want to use the word pseudo, but maybe pseudo is right.
You're welcome to say pseudo. Go on.
Pseudo-psychoanalyst called Richard Wiseman. And the central kind of thrust of his argument is, if you smile, you'll be happy. Like if you dance, you'll be energized. Like the positive behavior, the positive beliefs follow positive actions, not the other way around. So I feel torn about this because I can see the kind of logic behind it, but there's something a little bit kind of forced and maybe like nefarious about that thinking where, it's almost like if you encourage certain actions, if you like require, and he writes about this in the book, if you require young children to wave the national flag, they will become more patriotic, right? And so there is some fine line there about, is it good to enforce like certain types of rituals to bring together community, or is it kind of bad to like force feed a certain worldview such that everyone can kind of think in a homogenous way? And there is like a boundary there. But, to your earlier point, I totally agree. Like these same forms of propaganda very much exist in the internet outside of China, right? I think the key difference is just the level, the degree to which it takes place and the kind of authority of the sources where it comes from, right? Like Fox News is pushing a certain agenda, but you can go and turn to another news source that will have a completely opposite perspective, right? And then as for your point to, whether or not this is a positive thing, this is a question that I've been actually getting a lot recently. Like actually just a couple of days ago, a gentleman asked me, are there good parts to the Great Firewall? Like, is it good to have online regulation and, have some of these toxic material that we doom scroll through in the rest of the world removed? And I think the kind of to rephrase that question, I think it shouldn't be, whether or not the Great Firewall is a good thing, but how can we more effectively govern and regulate the type of content that appears on the web, right? And so there are a lot of things, like decisions that the Chinese government has taken with regards to governing technology that I actually think that I agree with, that I think are great. For example, like trying to limit addiction to video games, or trying to limit addiction to social media feeds by requesting like minors register on certain social media platforms, or like removing pornography, for example, from the web. I think the key issue with the framing of whether or not the Great Firewall is a good thing is that how those policies are enforced, who comes up with them, where do they come from, all of that is extremely opaque and top down. So regular people just like don't have a say in how their internet is governed. Whereas on the flip side, the chaos that we're seeing in a lot of the rest of the world is that there's a complete absence of regulation or a desire to deregulate because the social media companies have so much power. And their incentive, of course, is to keep you on the feeds as long as possible. And, that the way to do that is polarizing content, violence, misinformation.
I guess the best advert for the Chinese system is the fact that X is owned by a gentleman worth about $800 billion US, and he's tightly aligned with, the present inhabitant of the Oval Office. Also, this Richard Wiseman character. I mean, I can almost see the Adam Curtis documentary in 10 years' time now about a mediocre British pseudo-psychiatrist or psychologist becoming he had a middling book, wasn't so big here, but it was, central to Xi Jinping thought. And this interesting fusion of Marxism with, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. We live in a very, very strange time. But I do see so much overlap between the stuff you're talking about from the Chinese state. And obviously, you're right. In the West, generally speaking, there are multiple sources that people can draw upon. But this idea, for instance, of historical nihilism, as they refer to it in China, certainly under Xi, I know it obviously precedes him, but this idea that you shouldn't be too critical of the past, the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese nation, etc., and that this is a form of cultural nihilism. Again, Nigel Farage would say the exact same thing about the British Empire, and it is a really interesting impulse, which clearly goes beyond borders. So you mentioned pornography there a moment ago.
Yeah.
As I understand it, it's illegal to produce and to distribute. I suppose the production side is the better side to regulate. Is that a conversation that exists, for instance, in Chinese civil society? You hear it all the time, again, from conservatives in the West. Oh my God, OnlyFans is taking over, etc. Is that a critique that, the wolf warriors and the neo-Maoists make of places like Europe and the United States? Well, look, all the women over there are, obviously it's a stupid thing to say, it's not true, but as a caricature of our culture and decadence, they're saying that, they're all getting involved in pornography and,
There definitely is a strain of kind of conservative Chinese thought that fits very well with kind of conservative Western thought as well. I would say pornography is maybe part of, it's not the focus of, a critique of kind of Western decadence, particularly with regards to sex. So like the kind of rejection of a nuclear family, with filial piety and respect for parents and the desire to have offspring and the desire to commit to one person. I think there's a lot of conversation around that. I think there's a lot of kind of critique of, particularly within this kind of conservative sphere, of kind of queer life in the West is kind of this Western import, and kind of China does not have queer life. It's something that's just been a source of influence from abroad. And I guess like pornography does fit under that. I would say less so today, but definitely in the 90s, when China was accessing the internet for the first time, and there was this kind of opening of the door to the West, pornography was definitely seen as this like unhealthy Western import. But that came along with everything like sex before marriage, or like same-sex desire. And
So there's some people that claim this is all an outgrowth of the emergence of the internet, global digital culture, etc.
I would say like the number of people who still think that way is definitely on the decline, but certainly in the kind of 90s.
What about the upper echelons of the CCP, for instance? Is that a sort of mainstream view, or?
I haven't spoke to any of them personally, so I don't know. One person whose views are made pretty clear is one party official who I write about in the book, Wang Huning, who's kind of like the chief ideologue.
Yeah.
And he writes this book in 1989 called America Against America. And I'd say the worldview that he kind of came to then is still very much consistent to the worldview that he has today, which is this sense that kind of American laissez-faire liberalism and kind of a full-throated embrace of capitalism has created a society with no cultural values, and kind of a society that cannot hold and cannot support its citizens, right? It's kind of void of morals. And so I think he definitely still does have this view that when money and kind of capitalism is the central driving force of a country, it results in an erosion of family values. It results in an erosion of patriotism and kind of dedication to the nation state. He definitely does have that view. So if he is the kind of central ideologue for the party, I'm sure there are other people who also share that view. I will say that in the book, he was heavily influenced by the conservative writer Alan Bloom. So reading Alan Bloom will also give you a really clear sense of how Wang Huning thinks.
Yeah, he's a fascinating dude, right? And I'm trying to get a good English edition of that book. I can't find one. Obviously, I can't read Mandarin, sadly.
There's one on Amazon, I think.
Yeah, there is. But I look at the reviews and they're saying it's like a recent edition and it's poorly produced and poorly printed. Maybe I'll have to go to China to get one. But he's kind of like, the Chinese Alexander Dugin, I suppose, for people who are watching, if they're, vaguely familiar with that world. Of course, his proximity to Putin is contested, but a post-liberal kind of thinker. And increasingly in the West, we have lots of those people too, people like Patrick Deneen, who have this critique of maybe we got a lot wrong in the last 40 years with economic liberalism, both both economic and social. So neoliberalism going back to the 1980s and social liberalism going back to the 60s. So people like that, do they view the arrival of the internet almost as a potential kind of weapon of mass cultural destruction? That there was this imposition of what they view as foreign Western values, LGBT rights, sex before marriage, pornography, etc. I just want to sort of identify that perspective.
Yeah. I think they're very torn, right? Because the other kind of strand of that book, or the central idea of that book, is that technology has enabled America to be incredibly powerful and strong. So there is a deep strand of envy and admiration in what new technologies and emerging technologies, particularly something like the internet, can bring. And I think that tension is something that I explore with the book with regards to the internet, but I think is also very much prevalent in the party state's attitudes towards AI today, right? It's a balance that needs to be navigated. On one hand, these technologies like the internet can produce huge sources of innovation and kind of boost the economy and make China strong and powerful. On the other hand, it's a huge source of instability, and it's going to bring about all of these decadent values. I think that might have not been the kind of primary anxiety at the time, and still isn't, the kind of arrival of decadent values, as much as serving as a source of political instability and enabling kind of collective mobilization. I think for a long period of time, for example, if you were to look at the things that censors scrubbed off the internet, things like unhealthy marital values or kind of queer issues or kind of like quote unquote vulgar content, that was all over the internet because
Right.
that wasn't their primary concern. Their primary concern was sometimes even just like excessively patriotic users who were trying to rally a group together and get people to protest, right?
So they worry about collective action, basically.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is that, the internet is a source potentially of both strength and weakness.
Yes. And so I think that they're torn, right? And a lot of what the party is trying to do is what Deng Xiaoping said many years ago, which is like open the window to let things in, but inevitably flies will come in. So try to do the best they can to keep those flies out. And I would say that's a similar dance that they're trying to do with AI, which is, how can we ensure that this technology is diffused in every sector of society and kind of supercharges the economy in the way that we want to, but doesn't become this totally uncontrollable new thing that has impacts that ripple well into society that they don't have reins over.
Just as a user, what are the differences like between WeChat and WhatsApp or Alibaba and eBay? This might sound like a sort of puerile question, but is the user experience better? Is it inferior? Do you sometimes feel like the Chinese internet as a consumer, as an end user, is actually a better experience than the American or Western one?
Yeah, again, a total double-edged sword. So just to pick a very specific example, a platform that a lot of people associate with the Chinese internet is WeChat, right? And WeChat in many ways is a unique beast of its own. I don't think there exists any kind of corollary in the global internet. I think once upon a time people called WeChat China's Facebook, but that comparison has just completely been, thrown into the trash to the extent that Mark Zuckerberg now has been quoted to have WeChat envy. And when we say Mark Zuckerberg has WeChat envy, we're referring to the fact that WeChat has just penetrated like every facet of Chinese society. It is dubbed a super app. It's essentially kind of this online Swiss Army knife where you can do everything. So, firstly, the WeChat messaging platform, you're not just messaging your mom there, you're also messaging your boss, you're also messaging your client, you're also messaging the person who walks your dog, you're messaging the store owner who needs to sell you something. So everything is kind of centralized into one app. On WeChat, you're also making payments, you're also hailing cabs, you're also getting genetic tests. I've once done a genetic test on WeChat. Your bank platform is sometimes on there. And so on the plus side of that, right, the beneficial aspect of that is that it's extremely convenient and efficient, right? Everything can be done on one platform. All of your data is aggregated on one platform. It makes everything from payments to messaging an extremely kind of seamless and integrated process. Now, again, it's a double-edged sword because it also means that it's very easy to control, right? If all of your data is aggregated into one platform, you can be easily traced. Your payments can be easily traced. Who you're talking to can be easily surveilled. And evidence of this, for example, was during the COVID lockdowns in China. The two platforms that were used by authorities to kind of track and trace people and ensure that they weren't infected by COVID were WeChat and Alipay, arguably two of the largest kind of social media platforms in China. And this meant that essentially anyone who wanted to leave their building or go into a store or get onto a train needed to show that they had a green QR code on their WeChat platform. And if they didn't, they would just effectively be trapped at home. And that very app was also connected to, your phone's geotracking, your geolocation tracking. It was also connected to every single person that you'd ever talked to, right? Or every store that you'd visited. And so if you're optimizing for kind of privacy and the ability to move around the world without being surveilled, it's not exactly a great experience.
I'm going to say it again, guys, because it's really important. We're planning something huge here at Novara Media. Very, very big, but we need to hear from you guys first. The Novara Media Audience Survey is now live, and if you submit your responses by the end of Sunday, the 12th of April, you stand the chance of winning one of 5 £50 vouchers to spend at the Novara shop. That means books, teas, mugs, totes, whatever you want. If that sounds good, then follow the link in the description below or head to novara.media/survey to get started. And how do these major companies, how do they relate to not just the state, but the party? The Western question would be, well, maybe the state has the back end and there'll be various state agencies that liaise with people within the company. But of course, in China, as I understand it, there are parallel structures within these companies, which are, party affiliated. So there'll be party cells, etc. I think every private firm with more than, 9 employees, I think, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, has, a party cell. There is with, for instance, major cities, you have a city mayor, but you also have they'll have a parallel party official. So this is just a very different way of doing things. How does that shape people's experiences? So in Britain, for instance, there is, there's a widespread knowledge that the state has access to a bunch of things. We've known that since Snowden, right? The American and to a lesser extent the British state. But people say, well, you know what? I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't mind the surveillance. If you don't want to get caught, don't do anything illegal. How do Chinese consumers and end users relate to that level of surveillance, scrutiny, that fusion of state, party, and private enterprise?
I would say the ordinary Chinese user just doesn't think about it. I think they just assume that anything they put onto an online platform can be seen and found if necessary. At least that applies to every platform that exists within the firewall. And I would say the ordinary Chinese user doesn't feel like they are worried about that. I think similarly to maybe a lot of users in the UK, right? They will always choose convenience and efficiency over privacy and kind of avoiding surveillance, right? When the cookies come up, no one is picking, or very few people pay attention to that tab and they just kind of accept all, right? I think the difference in China is just like, you don't even have that option, right? And I guess the level of penetration and the level of access to that data is much, much more easy and much more opaque. Like, it's not a discussion that's being had in the public sphere. It's just something that you're supposed to kind of accept and take for granted.
How do people have those conversations politically? I mean, let's say you have misgivings about a certain policy. Obviously, you can't just, you can't go out protesting against, state surveillance in WeChat or whatever. But can ordinary Chinese, join the party, have those conversations within party cells? How does it work? Or is it just...
It's pretty opaque.
Right.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know what takes place and how that takes place on the level of, from the inside,
Yeah.
For example. I'm sure those conversations take place on the inside all the time. Every now and then, it kind of spills out into the public sphere, or very excellent researchers are able to kind of dig deeper and see how that conversation unfolds. One example of that, I think, that has been really compelling in the realm of kind of AI policy and the governance of algorithms, I'd recommend this paper written by Matt Sheehan, who works at the Carnegie Endowment of Peace. And it's about how China put together its regulations on delivery algorithms or recommendation algorithms, specifically with regards to delivery services. And this was a kind of a rare example of how public grievance and pushback that was then amplified by the news made its, had its influence and impact all the way to kind of the highest level of policy. So the story was in 2020, a couple of sociologists in China did this really massive investigation into the ways in which the delivery platforms, the two big ones in China, Ele.me and Meituan, were using these algorithms to kind of accelerate the delivery times of its drivers in ways that were incredibly dehumanizing, right? They were creating routes that were dangerous and sometimes illegal. It was leading to deaths, it was leading to injuries. And every time drivers were able to kind of hit a new time and drive faster, they would then, the system would ramp it up again. And so it created this like vicious cycle where drivers were just like continually trying to make ever more dangerous and ever quickening delivery speeds. They talked about how they were using these algorithms to like gamify the system so that drivers would be trying to get to like king level to, reach X amounts of deliveries. And that story was then published in a Chinese magazine called Renwu People. And it totally took off. Like people were really angered by this. They were kind of speaking out and expressing their grievances towards the kind of systems and the conditions that delivery drivers were suffering under. And eventually, I don't know how many years after, it might have been 2022 or 2023, in one of, I think we'll have to check that, but China's algorithm regulation, I want to say 2023, included a clause specifically about how the algorithms used by delivery platforms had to be kind of humane and respect the working conditions of drivers, right? So we often think of Chinese policymaking as completely opaque, and in many ways it is very opaque, but every now and then we see a policy decision that's directly in response to something that has taken place in Chinese society and has been voiced by the public.
I mean, that's the thing. The Chinese system, and people don't like to basically admit this in the West, but it's clearly responsive, right? There's that great quote by Eric Lee, where he says, in the West, you have systems where the parties can change, but the policies can't. Here, the party can't change, but the policy can. And that's just, that's empirically verifiable when you look at, post-Deng China, Xi, clearly it's gone in a different direction, post-Cultural Revolution, Hu Jintao, earlier on with Mao, these huge policy decisions, clearly responding for right or wrong in a way that is clearly much quicker and much more thorough than you see in the West. And I find that really interesting, the idea that you have a system without trade unions where, you don't have a pluralistic party system, and yet you still get outcomes, actually, which a pretty good friend uses. I don't know. It's an interesting one. And you've got this organization with, nearly 100 million members in the Communist Party. I'm curious about the kinds of conversations they have. The title of this book, Walldancers, Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet. What is a Walldancer?
Yeah, so I came up with the term, but it comes from this Chinese phrase, dancing in shackles, or 带着铁链跳舞. And as far as I know, is first used by Chinese journalists in the early 2000s. And they were using it to describe the kind of process of writing and reporting under state constraints, like having to self-censor, having to remove certain ideas from their pieces in order to push stories or get across a truth that they were excited about. But soon after, it was used by all kinds of people, and I've heard this phrase used by Chinese science fiction writers, Chinese musicians, Chinese software engineers. And I found that it resonated with me in particular when I moved to China, because it really captured this experience of living in China as a kind of dance, this kind of dynamic push and pull between state and society, this kind of swinging between freedom and control. And I found that this dynamic was most evident on the Chinese internet behind what we know as the Great Firewall. And so I came to know the people who were particularly good at navigating this terrain and doing this dance. I came to know them as dancers or wall dancers.
So who are the major wall dancers in this book? Just maybe go over one or two of them.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go with the first two I discuss. One is a man called Ma Baoli, and he grew up in a small town in northeastern China where he was studying to be a policeman. at an early age, he realized that he was gay, but according to his textbooks at school, that meant you were either mentally ill or a criminal. And so he kept his secret to himself. But one day he stumbles upon a short story online in an internet cafe called Beijing Story, written by an anonymous writer, about two young men who fall in love and have this tumultuous affair. And he's like, I feel so seen. It was a revelatory, cathartic moment for him. And inspired by that, he decides to create a gay website to connect kind of queer men from across the country. The team grows to 5 people, to 10 people. He moves to Beijing. He gets found out. He comes out. Fast forward a decade later, by the time I meet him in 2019, he is the CEO of Blued, the largest gay dating app, not just in China, but in the world. And he's about to take his company public on the New York Stock Exchange. And so that's one of the subjects I follow. The second one that I'll talk about is Liu Pin, who started out as a journalist at a state-run organization called China Women's News. She was feeling quite stifled by that experience and ended up becoming a freelance writer and founded Feminist Voices, which was China's most influential feminist magazine at the time. And it really became viral and popular when she put it on Weibo, China's microblogging platform. And it became this kind of platform and hub for young feminists all across the country, so much so that she became dubbed kind of the godmother of Chinese feminist activists. And they organized all kinds of campaigns together, the most famous being the Bloody Brides protest in 2012, where they walked down Tiananmen kind of dressed in these fake wedding gowns splattered in fake blood to raise awareness of domestic violence. And all of this was really exciting until 2015, when there was an arrest and detention of 5 feminist activists known as the Feminist Five. Liu Pin just happened to be in New York at the time and ended up staying there out of fear of repercussion. And although she was a little worried about the movement going underground and her work no longer being relevant, it turns out she still could, but she was just doing a lot of that work from the diaspora and online, and did a lot of heavy lifting, for example, when China's Me Too movement kind of burst forth in 2017, 2018.
That story about Mao Baoli, I hope I've said his name correctly. I mean, it's an extraordinary story. That sounds like it should be a movie. I'm sure it will be a movie, hopefully in English as well. But that gets to the heart of what we were talking about a moment ago with Wu Huning. You know, this tension between creativity, economic dynamism, and then just a change in social mores and social values. If you're a conservative, you won't like that, and if you're not, you probably will. If you're a gay person, you definitely will. And I suppose here's an interesting question for me: is that this relationship to the internet of personal exploration, self-examination, maybe a critique of the society that surrounds you. In the case of Mao Baoli, you know, feeds through to entrepreneurialism and a huge business. The man's, you know, obviously very successful. And that really gets to the heart of lots of technology companies, right? Do you think those kinds of entrepreneurs are now being produced under Xi's China? And is that pipeline still there of, you know, personal discovery and exploration to new business models, new business ventures that, you know, maybe were inconceivable 20 years earlier? Because that's the strength of the US model, right? And some people say that's the weakness of the Xi model, you know, Xi Jinping thought. What's your view?
I think yes. I just think that the type of entrepreneur that's being produced is very different. And if we were to kind of divide the different entrepreneurs and the types that have emerged over the last 3 decades, I think they are all innovative, but innovative in different ways, both under and not under the Xi period, right? So the kind of typical or archetypal entrepreneur that we think of and that I think of as part of Ma Baoli's generation is Jack Ma. And this is someone who came of age when China was opening up to the world. So there's a sense of, you know, the West can produce this, Silicon Valley can produce this, let's create that at home, but better. The kind of personality and kind of public presence of that type of founder is very gregarious and open-facing and loud and bold, right? And they're bold in a kind of public-facing way as well. The emphasis there is also then rooted to the technology, which is the browser-based internet, which was very much about connecting people with one another, connecting people to the consumer, right? And so I think all of that kind of selects for a certain type of open-mindedness and a desire to kind of connect China and the world. And that's what I associate with Jack Ma, right? And that generation of entrepreneurs. Then you have the next generation, which arguably did come of age and become famous when Xi Jinping had also taken power. And this is people like Zhang Yiming, who is the founder of ByteDance. And so Zhang Yiming kind of created ByteDance in 2010, and TikTok really emerged in the mid-2010s, so 2016. Compared to someone like Jack Ma, he's still incredibly innovative. ByteDance arguably is a much more successful company on the global stage than Alibaba, right? TikTok is the most influential social media platform, not just in China, in the world. And I think what they were producing then was not just, okay, we're going to take a product from the West and try to recreate it in China, but it's like, let's create something homegrown and then make it a global platform. So I think the kind of archetype of the entrepreneur in the mid-2010s is very much rooted in the mobile internet in particular, right? How can we create something in China unique to the mobile internet, which has taken off faster in China than anywhere else in the world, and then put that out into the global web? That being said, they're much more cautious, at least politically in relationship to the state, than their predecessors. I don't think I've heard Zhang Yiming give a single interview after 2016. He's almost the opposite of Jack Ma. Jack Ma is famous for like performing "Can't You Hear the Love Tonight" dressed up in like rocker garb in front of 16,000 people. Zhang Yiming wears kind of the same t-shirt and pants combination every day. So there is this sense of reticence and this sense of like, we are going to create this very fascinating product, but we're not necessarily going to push for any type of like liberal change in maybe the ways the entrepreneurs were thinking about in the 80s. And then today you have a cohort of founders who are creating AI labs and AI companies. And in many ways, they are just as, if not even more, kind of influential than their predecessors, and not any less innovative. So the names that are coming to the top of my head are people like Liang Wenfeng, who is the founder of DeepSeek, as well as people like Yang Zhilin, who is a founder of Moonshot, Tang Jie, who founded Zhipu AI. And so you have these leaders, and they're very different in that they all come from Tsinghua, for example, Tsinghua University, which is essentially kind of like the Harvard of China, and produces a lot of technical talent. And they all have very, very technical backgrounds. So the type of founder that's being produced today are people who like really understand the nuts and bolts of the technology. And they, compared to their predecessors, are very, very quiet. I don't think Yang Wenfeng has given a single interview ever. And I think here what they're prized for is their ability to kind of push the frontier of a technology, right? Not to necessarily commercialize it as quickly as possible or like create a very cool social platform that connects people with one another. But that profile I'm still watching and trying to understand.
That's interesting. So just to massively overgeneralize, that Jack Ma cohort kind of was seeking to imitate, a Western entrepreneur, charismatic business person. And what you're saying is that the newer cohort, very much STEM-minded, less gregarious, and as you seem to insinuate, the associations of political change being downstream from technological change are less loud than they were 20 years ago.
Definitely. I'd say they're probably much more cautious, but they're also probably much more confident. Like they're confident in their ability to build without the help and influence of Silicon Valley, without the approval or the need of Silicon Valley, right? Because I think they've seen that China can innovate, which, up until 2014, 2016, I think the narrative was China can't innovate because it doesn't have XYZ, it doesn't have political freedoms, freedom of speech. And that narrative has kind of been thrown on its head.
When does that change? Because I mean, I remember having conversations really as late as COVID, saying that China is going to have global leadership in at least some technologies, renewables, electric vehicles, and so on. That was just, to me, that was obvious by virtue of the scale of the domestic market, and people in this country just weren't having any of it. But like you say, I think even amongst many Chinese, that wasn't necessarily all that clear until maybe a few years earlier than that. So when is that inflection point that domestic Chinese industrialist entrepreneurs say, actually, we can be the best in class, and we don't just need to imitate America, we can actually sell our products to them?
I would say 2014, with the arrival of these entrepreneurs like Zhang Yiming, who founded ByteDance. I think a lot of them, I think he even wrote in his blog, going to Silicon Valley, kind of looking around and being like, okay, this is pretty good, but the next technological revolution is going to take place at home. There is a sense of we can create something better. I think.
But where did that come from? Because to bring it back here, Europeans don't have that right now. There's clearly an ambition from some places like France with Mistral and in Paris and whatnot, and Macron is talking about technological autonomy for Europe. Clearly, it's a pipe dream right now. But China has the confidence to do that stuff and has for a long time. I'm so curious where it came from.
Yeah. With that particular shift, and then I think there are other shifts that kind of accelerated that narrative, it was the arrival of the mobile internet. And, now when we think about the mobile internet and how mobile everyone is in the world, it doesn't come as this huge kind of transformation. But back then in 2014, like the speed with which China embraced mobile was totally kind of mind-boggling, right? The kind of word of the day was leapfrog, because you were going from a few years ago, like carrying suitcases of cash to pay your rent, to doing it all on WeChat, right? By the time I was arriving there, like everyone was using QR codes to make payments. And the shift of that and the pace of that was much, much faster than what had happened in the US or anywhere else in the world. And so there is this sense, I think, among entrepreneurs that we're living in such a deeply connected society. It's so much easier to build a product and a platform on that, right? If so many people are using mobile phones, let's take Zhang Yiming, his first product was Toutiao, which means kind of today's headlines. It was a news app. And his kind of revelation was everyone's using their phones. He was sitting on the train one day and he noticed that people were using their phones to read the news. And he was like, what if I created a platform that just fed people the news they wanted to read? Like, I wasn't just going to connect people with people or people with cars, which was what, Mark Zuckerberg and Travis Kalanick was doing, right? He was like, I'm going to connect people to the information they want to see. And given the fact that China had such a wired kind of population, and the fact that they were so embracing of new technologies and how easy it was to collect that data, it meant that Toutiao could grow huge and become really popular really quickly. And the algorithm that fueled Toutiao was what would be the kind of backbone of the algorithm that fueled Douyin and TikTok, right? So TikTok, I think, is a big kind of turning point in the public imagination and the global imagination of China's ability to innovate. And so much of that was rooted in the arrival of the mobile internet.
People at the moment are talking about how many millionaires are leaving this country. It's questionable about the accuracy of some of those figures. And then that's something that's also said about China. China's losing loads of millionaires. But what I find intriguing is it's seeing a net addition of PhDs. So I think more PhDs are now going back to China than leaving. I think that's a great place to be. And it speaks about that level of sort of intellectual confidence about the country inventing the technologies of the future. This date of 2014 and self-recognition of China as a potential global leader with technologies, it's around then we also see for me anyway, the emergence of lots of quite epochal Chinese science fiction. And you mentioned Chinese sci-fi already. I think some people will be familiar with, I'm sorry for pronouncing this name like I am, Is Yi-Ling Liu?
Yes. Yeah. So Liu Cixin is how he's referred to it. Yeah.
People like that, Fascinating stuff. And for people who aren't aware, you should absolutely read The Three-Body Problem. Amazing trilogy. Where does Chinese science fiction fit in all of this? And this idea of, a country on the cusp of modernity, but also inventing the future. These two things, to me anyway, as an outsider, seem to go hand in hand. I'm curious about the relationship between them.
Definitely. I think one of the key reasons why Chinese science fiction took off when it did, which was during this period of 2014 to 2016, was the ways in which Chinese technology was transformative and were the ways in which the internet and the mobile internet was kind of exploding into Chinese public life. And so I think it probably did two things. On one hand, because technology and the internet was transforming Chinese society so quickly, there was a sense of kind of excitement, but there was also a sense of anxiety and a sense of uncertainty, right? Where this world was going to head, right? I think a lot of people wanted some kind of meaning making around how technology was going to change the future. Even just like walking around Beijing or walking around Chengdu during this period, or when I arrived slightly later in 2017, it often felt like I was kind of stepping into some kind of cyberpunk fiction, right? Aesthetically and just in terms of the vibes, it felt like things were changing very quickly. And so domestically, I think the appeal of that type of genre was this desire for meaning, this desire for like a prophet or a soothsayer to say what's going on. One of the people that I profile in the book is a science fiction writer called Chen Xiufan. And I found it fascinating that it wasn't just readers and science fiction nerds who were turning to him for advice. Like he was getting invited by like Tencent and like these tech companies and academic institutions to just like talk about things that, even though he's a very smart man, like completely outside of his pay grade, because they saw him as a prophet of the future. And so domestically, I think that's how kind of science fiction became so popular. I would say globally, a lot of it can be attributed to Liu Cixin and the three-body problem. Like a lot of science fiction writers consider him to be the kind of tentpole and the man who just like propelled Chinese sci-fi onto the global stage.
He's the GOAT.
Exactly. Right. And a key reason was the fact that he won the Hugo Award in 2015 and was the first Chinese person to do that. And then suddenly, Barack Obama was reading him and putting him on his kind of list of must-reads. I remember Mark Zuckerberg was reading him. And so he was kind of propelled, into international media as this science fiction star. And this kind of coincided exactly as this shift that we're talking about of China suddenly becoming a technological powerhouse, somewhere that needed to be emulated and understood and not just kind of a technological backwater or a copycat nation. Yeah. And so I think the fascination with Chinese sci-fi also kind of coincided with that.
I mean, for me, it was a really striking moment. I remember reading the trilogy in, I think maybe 2020. And the first one is beautifully translated. The other two aren't so great, but they're all great. They're fantastic books. And I remember thinking after finishing that final part of the trilogy, what kind of culture gives rise to such an extraordinary mind, such an extraordinary person, such an extraordinary storyteller, And it's similar to, if you read The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas, and you think, what kind of culture gives rise to somebody that can just tell such an exquisite story? And it did, in a way, pique my interest more in Chinese politics than any sort of, nonfiction, in a way. Like I can read your book, Fabulous Book, or Karen Howe, or Dan Wang. But it really was a wake-up moment for me. So are there others like him, or this idea now of, Chinese sci-fi being at the cutting edge of that genre? Is that actually just one dude who's just a generational talent, or are there other writers being listened to at scale, by senior people in commerce and politics, like Is Yi-Ling Liu?
Yeah, many. I would say there are definitely tons of Chinese science fiction writers who are kind of respected and lauded. They might not have received the same amount of attention, particularly global attention, as Liu Cixin, especially, like no one has a Netflix TV show yet, but, just some names that I'll rattle off. Chen Xiufan or Stanley Chen, who I profile in my book, has had an immense amount of influence, at the very least domestically, but he's also invited to participate in, conferences around the world, from COP to like artist residencies in LA, and is kind of influential, at least within the science fiction community. You have a woman called Hao Jingfang, who, fascinating story, is a kind of macroeconomics researcher by day and focuses on the effects of automation on the economy. And she does most of her science fiction writing at night. But she wrote a short story called Folding Beijing, which ended up winning the Hugo Award in 2016. And so she became, for Best Novella, and she became the first Chinese woman to do so. That story, Folding Beijing, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I've not read it, no, to my immense,
Apparently,
shame.
I think it also has been, it's very short. It's a very short and quick read. And at some point I think someone was planning to make it into a film. I don't know what has happened to that. But the premise is that Beijing in this fictional world is divided into three. And it kind of rotates like a cube. And it's the first class, the second class, and the third class. And when two of the classes go to sleep, the next class kind of wakes up. The earth rotates and they wake up. And they kind of align along how we think of the first, second, and third classes. So the first class is the elite. They're wealthy. They've got blue skies. They've got beautiful tree-lined homes. Everyone has a job that they love. These are also kind of people in political power. Then you have the middle class, which is what we would associate with the middle class in our world. And then the third class are primarily waste workers. So they were the people who first came, built the whole folding infrastructure, and then now just process the waste of the first two classes. And it really struck a chord in 2016 when it was published, because it resonated so deeply with people who were frustrated with kind of inequality in Chinese cities, especially for migrant workers who really identified with the third class. Like, here were the people who came to the cities, built it from the ground up, built the buildings, worked the factories, were the kind of delivery drivers and nannies. And in 2016, 2017, there was this process of evicting many of them and having them forcibly leave the cities because their labor was no longer necessary. And so Folding Beijing became really popular and a topic of conversation and kind of social discussion at the time. So Hao Jingfang, there's another writer called Han Song, who is slightly older than the two that I mentioned, who writes these all kinds of science fiction stories as early as like the early 2000s to present day. Some of his stories are pretty scathing critiques of some of the kind of problems of China's political system. I think one story that I really enjoyed was called like Bullet Train. I'm going to have to double check that. But it was written, I think, largely as a response to I'm not totally sure on this. I think it was written in response to the Wenzhou train crash, but he was kind of criticizing a society that moved at such fast speed, but to the kind of harm and detriment of the people. And it said to me.
Is science fiction, speculative fiction, is that one of the primary means by which people now have these political conversations which would otherwise be off the table? Because as you were talking there about Folding City, I thought of Thomas More and Utopia. Now, many people think of Utopia as, one of the first exercises in utopian thinking, but actually it was intended, so we're told, it was intended as a critique of Henry VIII's England by Thomas More, about how it was being misgoverned. It was holding up a mirror to a dysfunctional reality. Is that actually quite a common thing with the genre of science fiction in China?
Yeah, I would say that it depends on the story and it depends on when it was written. I would say it's like a lot harder for that to take place with stories that are written today. For example, I don't even know if Folding Beijing, if it was written today, would be published.
Interesting. Because a publisher wouldn't pick it up, or the writer would self-censor. Where on the pipeline would that?
All of it could be
Right.
true, right? I think at the time, there was effort to try to suppress some of the conversation that was taking place around Folding Beijing because it became so out of hand. But I would say, yes, definitely, like, science fiction is a really kind of fertile and compelling place for people to critique kind of technological upheaval and critique technological progress at all costs, because it's not tied to any particular vision of history, right? It's kind of veiled by the future. You don't have to be, you can set your story outside of China, right? You can set your story in the United States and it could come across as a critique of another country, right? And so I think it has the benefit of that veil of having kind of multiple visions of the future. That being said, I think it's still kind of hard to be on the nose. Even something like Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem, some people have said it was published in 2008, but it's unclear whether or not something like that could be published today. I don't know if you know this, but the Chinese original and the English translation are slightly different. The English version begins with a scene from the Cultural Revolution, and so is a Netflix TV show. Whereas if you read the Chinese version, that scene is kind of buried in the middle. And Ken Liu, who translated the first volume of The Three-Body Problem, kind of brought this up with Liu Cixin and said, hey, I think this scene would actually work so much better here. Can we move it? And he said, oh, that's originally where it was. But my publishers suggested that we kind of hide it somewhere in the middle. So that's not the first thing that, censors read when they're deciding whether or not this should make it through. So would that book even be published today? It's really unclear.
What did you think of the Netflix series, by the way? Just quickly as an aside.
Yeah. I thought it was not bad.
You're too diplomatic. I thought it was terrible because there was so much pushback, wasn't there, from these Chinese nationalists online saying this appalling production of this wonderful Chinese book.
Yeah, I think maybe their main gripe was the fact that it just wasn't set in China, right? It just like all of the actors were foreigners, and I get why they made that artistic, decision, this desire to make it more relatable and more kind of accessible to a popular audience.
I don't know, man. I thought it was terrible.
Okay.
I thought it was terrible.
It wasn't amazing, let's say that.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. And interesting, this idea that fiction can serve as a mirror for domestic regimes and governments when you talk about foreigners. I mean, another example of that is Montesquieu, right? The Persian letters. You have two Persians slagging off, I think it's an Uzbek and a Persian, I can't remember. They're slagging off, various bits of government, which at that time Montesquieu is experiencing in France and in Europe. I mean, that's a pretty big deal that you're saying that the Three-Body Problem might not get published in China today. So has China under Xi Jinping, has it become a less intellectually, culturally interesting, vibrant place over the last 10 years?
That's a big question. And I don't know if I can necessarily generalize, right? Because I think in so many ways, yes, depending on like what sector you're looking at, what specific areas of discourse that you're looking at, but in many ways, no. And so the ways in which I would say yes is the kind of pluralism and vibrancy and the kind of amount that you can share and express yourself online. I think that has been constrained quite tightly. So the Weibo of today looks incredibly different from the Weibo in 2010 to 2013, right? That was a period in which all kinds of big Vs, that's what they were called, verified influencers, were taking on to that platform to express their views on everything from like constitutionalism to, independent media and press freedoms, people were using it as this kind of space to call truth to power. They were kind of calling out corrupt officials on that platform. It was very, very vibrant and very lively. Today, none of those conversations would be taking place on Weibo. It's become a primarily kind of celebrity entertainment focused platform. Every now and then, a conversation that will come up that is quite interesting and sometimes quite provocative, but all very quickly get shut down, right? So in that sense, I think it's become much more constrained. But then, if we were to look, for example, at conversations about feminism and what does it mean to be a woman in today's China, I would say arguably, even though there are more constraints on what can and cannot be said, I've seen that become much more vibrant, and women are kind of, even if they're not explicitly expressing kind of opposition to the party state, they are expressing completely new views on motherhood and marriage and how they want to live their lives as women. There are many more women who are comfortable being single, women who are talking about egg freezing, women who are debating the merits of taking their husband's last names, and so I think there's a lot more space for women to think about their place in society than when, Xi Jinping first became the leader in 2012. And so there are many examples of that. I think places where areas that have become much more constrained, but then areas that have become much more vibrant. I'd say another area that has become much more vibrant that might be of interest is just like the narratives around tech entrepreneurship, right? I think it's just become a lot more sophisticated in terms of how people understand and relate to the West, in terms of this kind of cultural confidence and this ability to kind of build new ideas and build new ways of seeing what it means to start a tech company. I think maybe 10 years ago, there was a lot more of how can we emulate what's taking place abroad and bring that back home. And now there's more of this sense of like, how can we cultivate something homegrown and put it out into the world?
Awe is probably a strong word, and I doubt, people in general have had a sense of awe about the West for a while now, but has that sense of admiration, has that been diluted in the last 10 years? Because I presume that goes hand in hand with this increased self-confidence, and actually there were certain expectations or views or assumptions about the West which we were wrong about. Is that something you might hear from a more liberally minded Chinese, for instance?
Absolutely. I would say there's like 100% been a dilution, this sense of, and this is, I think, a sentiment that is echoed by all kinds of Chinese people, both on the conservative end and the more liberal, the kind of patriotic and the more oppositional. I think for a long time, the West, and in particular the United States, was kind of viewed as this beacon, right? This benchmark that China had to reach. There's this phrase that the moon is always rounder in the West. There's this sense like, like if you, like the dream was to get a student visa, go abroad, get a university degree abroad and stay there. And I think that narrative has been slowly shifting as early as I'd say like the 2010s with a term, I remember a term became popular in the 2010s, haigui, which means, it literally means turtles or like sea turtles, but the pun on that phrase in Chinese, it means like overseas returnees. So I remember in like the 2015, 2016 period, a lot of kind of Chinese students were realizing, oh, the job opportunities that I'm most excited about are back home. And this kind of dream of staying abroad and kind of living the American dream was no longer compelling, right? And so everyone wanted to return to China. I think that kind of disillusionment and shift has become even more marked just in the past year. And I think it is now taking place not just among Chinese people, but among people living in the United States and living in the West, right? I think we're seeing this with the emergence of these trends like China maxing and this weird vibe shift of Silicon Valley China envy, right? There's like all kinds of people who are now doing these like 2-week trips to China and being totally starry-eyed and being like, wow, China's building these humanoid robots, and they're like they've got high-speed rail. There's like obsession with Chinese high-speed rail. And I think a lot of that is less about China and more about kind of the West's disillusionment or maybe disappointment with its own dysfunction. And so I think that's maybe the biggest turn that we're seeing, particularly with things like the launch of DeepSeek R1 last January, which awoken so many people in the US to kind of how quickly China was catching up, and also with more kind of mainstream cultural phenomena like the migration of TikTok refugees to Red Note also that month, where people are realizing, oh, there's actually this really vibrant online sphere here, and it doesn't look too different and actually might be superior to ours back home.
That was an amazing moment, right? I mean, you talk about that in the book where
Yeah.
you had American people going onto this app and they were sharing pictures of their cats, right? As
Yeah.
a payment for people walking them through this new platform.
Yeah. I mean, when I first encountered that moment and saw all these kind of American TikTok users migrating into Red Note or Xiaohongshu, the kind of first feeling that I got was one of delight. I think primarily delight because this was the first time in a long time that I'd seen just like ordinary online users who had been so siloed from one another for so long, just like goof around and share the kind of daily facts of their lives, share their like rent prices, share what they did for work, and these photos of their cats, as you mentioned. And I think a lot of my delight was rooted in the fact that this hadn't happened in a long time, right? The narratives that we're being fed about the other in each country has become increasingly a narrative of demonization, right? A narrative of how bad the other society is. And then
that exists in China as well. So the United
absolutely,
States is increasingly viewed as a toxic society.
absolutely. So one phrase that has become really popular in China and Chinese social media is this phrase kill line or shaxian. And it specifically refers to a moment when society has become so impoverished and devastated and decrepit that it can no longer return to what it was. And unfortunately, like kill line is the term that is being used to refer to American society. So you get these like photos and videos of like homelessness and drug use and gun violence, and it's paired with that phrase like America has surpassed its kill line. And
Where does that? That's a great phrase. Well, it's obviously it's not referring to great things, but where does that come from? Kill line.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the etymology is. I'm gonna have to look into that.
I wonder if it's from science fiction as well.
Yeah. But that like it obviously there is like some kernel of truth just in the way that some of Silicon Valley's envy of kind of China and China maxing is rooted in some kernel of truth, but it's an exaggerated one, right? It's like America is not just guns and violence and poverty, but it's a way to kind of maybe grapple with some insecurities that Chinese netizens feel themselves around the country's own economic stagnation and kind of unemployment prospects. It's much easier to deal with that and the discomfort of that when you like look across the Pacific and you're like, well, they have it really bad.
That's so interesting.
Right? Yeah.
So your hypothesis is that they're both projecting feelings of insecurity in the other. I mean, you talk about that in the book, right? So you open up two different platforms, two different languages, and you have two different interpretations of events. One is that China's on the verge of collapse. These people have predicted 25 of the last, 2 Chinese economic downturns. And then on the other one, China is ready to become, number one by 2050. And there's this interesting kind of view from both sides that the other is in decline. So the West is now very habitually referring to Chinese economic growth stagnating, which is kind of inevitable. It will slow down. Obviously, the working age population is literally shrinking, very low fertility rate. And you're saying the same thing is happening in reverse with regards to China. So you have, I presume you have videos of people, taking opioids, open air opioids on Skid Row or something and walking around like zombies and this sort of stuff.
Yeah, there definitely is like a love of criticizing San Francisco in particular and the homelessness population, how like America just can't build enough homes, right? Because, Dan has probably mentioned this in his book, but China and the US have completely different problems when it comes to the real estate crisis, right? China has this like surplus of apartment buildings and just like ghost towns of empty homes, whereas in America, like there just isn't enough capacity to even build homes for people. And so I think the sight of people kind of wandering around cities, unable to find a place to sleep, is something that the kind of Chinese user who wants to like push a kind of Schadenfreude, kind of like we have it better than you. It's a great kind of video to share around and spread.
I mean, Dan says that Chinese and American sort of internet users are obsessed with one another, not least because their cultures are so similar in many ways, which is a really interesting thought. I suppose in the middle of all of this is literally, if you're going across Eurasia, is Europe.
Mm.
How do Chinese look at Europeans, particularly in the context of the last 15 years? Because we're talking about declinist narratives, maybe the excesses of social liberalism or economic stagnation. I mean, it's pretty clear that Western Europe in particular has major problems there. How do Chinese people kind of view that? What are the online narratives around it? Or are they not even fussed about Western Europe? Is it just somewhere they go on holiday sometimes?
Yeah, my instinct was that, and obviously I don't want to generalize, right? I think there are probably cohorts of Chinese people who deeply admire Europe and cohorts who maybe completely reject Western Europe. But I'd say there definitely isn't this kind of dominant narrative as there is in the US of kind of deep envy and this desire to be like. I think Europe is almost like Disneyland. It's like as you said, a place to go to vacation, like a place that has a lot of culture, a place that is maybe highbrow and a little snooty, like a place where you can go and consume things. I think that's maybe like the primary association of Europe right now. But maybe things will shift, particularly among people who are maybe like more politically minded or policymakers, and they might perceive Europe as a potential ally or like a counterpoint to the United States, which has become in many ways an antagonistic figure, right? I think that is also potentially a perception among those who aren't just thinking about their own lives and travel and where to go to next.
And finally, on the internet, there's a cultural conversation in this country, certainly, and across the West, I think, people like Cory Doctorow are at the heart of it, where actually there's a revision, there's a collective revision going on, assessing, the costs and benefits of a digital-first internet culture over the last 25 years. And people that were maybe previously quite optimistic and utopian about it are now kind of black-pilled on the internet. Amongst Chinese people, is there something similar? Has the internet disappointed as a tool of liberation, which of course is a theme that runs throughout all the stories in your book? Or are people still optimistic about it because, post-2008, people in Britain have this declinist narrative, but clearly there's a very different reality in China. Does that carry through to assessments of the digital sphere as well? Or are they increasingly skeptical or even cynical about this technology?
Yeah. My instinct is that the kind of cultural conversation and the tone and the vibe around the internet as something positive or negative is still quite positive. Like it doesn't feel like it's captured the same sentiment of being black-pilled as it has in the West. And I think a big reason behind it is just how quickly it transformed people's lives in a very compressed amount of time. Like the internet is associated, and emerging technologies in general is associated with a kind of huge improvement in daily life and livelihood, right? And I think it isn't associated with that as much in the West, just because the amount of transformation that has taken place has not been as radical, right? We weren't jumping from suitcases of cash to being able to just like scan a QR code. There was a period of like, everyone had credit cards, and then from credit cards. So like, I think the kind of lived experience of improvement is so much more visceral among Chinese people. That is also playing out, I think, in conversations around AI, for example. I think, at least in the West and in the US, we're hearing a lot of narratives that are rooted in a kind of doomerism and a kind of fear of both near-term risks, but also like catastrophic existential risks. There's this sense of fear surrounding what AI can potentially do. And I think in China, those conversations certainly do take place, but they don't yet feel like the dominant tone. And again, this is not to say everyone's like super optimistic and jolly about the technologies. Like there's certainly conversations about what it's doing to people in terms of their mental health, in terms of safety and kind of misinformation. But the kind of overall vibe just feels a little bit more forward-looking and optimistic.
So optimistic about the future and less doomerist. On that note, Yi-Ling, it's been fabulous to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. That was really fun.
That was all good.
Yeah.